Rashi does not usually explore why one parsha in the Torah follows the other, unless it's critically important for us to understand the pshat, the simple understanding of the story. So we are curious, how come it is that Rashi says, you know why the spies follow Miriam? Well, why are you asking the question in the first place? And then, of course, the fact that Rashi makes the comparison is in itself interesting. We'll pick up certain nuances in the way that Rashi says it. Just as Miriam spoke about her brother Moshe, so they spoke about the land. And you might think actually that there's a comparison over here, almost as if to say that they had spoken badly, yet Rashi uses a word like dibba, which could be interpreted as positive or as negative. And so what we're going to discover is that Rashi is concerned by the fact that it's not uncommon in the Torah to put barriers in between two stories, even if they are chronological, because sometimes we need to distinguish between the two, and that would have been a good idea over here, so that we don't get a sense that Miriam and the spies are considered similar personalities. That's why you would have expected the Torah to separate the two. Why does the Torah have the two of them together? Because they should have learnt a lesson from Miriam's behavior. And the lesson they should have learned was not necessarily about speaking badly, but about speaking too much. Sometimes that's the problem. It's the beginning of our parsha where it says Shlach lecha anoshim. The Eibusha tells Moshe Rabbeinu, send these spies. Perish Rashi, Lom anismacha parshas Meraglim, the parshas Miriam. Why, says Rashi, is the story of the Meraglim so soon after the story of Miriam? Lefi sheloksal iske diba, because Miriam was so-called punished for having engaged in talk. Shedibra be'achiha, she spoke about her brother Moshe. And these wicked people, the spies, saw what happened and they did not take a lesson from it. We need to understand. We already see in many places that because Rashi only rarely compares the flow of one parasha into the next, that implies to us that it's not really an issue that we have to deal with typically in the world of pshat to understand why one parasha follows on after another. It's not something that bothers us too much. And of course, if the storyline is actually chronological, and in a second we're going to see that this is very chronological, then the pshat is not bothered by the fact that this parasha follows that parasha. It makes sense. It's chronology. So it really doesn't make sense in our case. This is raised by many of the commentaries. Seeing as the story of the Meraglim happened literally one day after Miriam was released from her quarantine, which was on the 28th of Sivan, and this was now on the 29th of Sivan. So according to Pshat, why would you even raise the question? Why does Shlach come after Baal Oisra? Obviously why? Because the stories happened directly one after the next. So that's going to be our main question. Why does Rashi feel the need to explain the juxtaposition of these two parashas? In addition to that, we have a series of questions on the wording that Rashi uses. There are a few nuances in the language of Rashi that we have to explore, mayhem including Aleph, Lefi sheloksa al iske diba. Why does Rashi use a euphemistic expression? That Miriam was smitten because of the engagement with diba. What does that mean? Hayaloi loymar al lashon hara. He should have just said, Miriam was punished for speaking Lashon Hara, and these people also spoke Lashon Hara. Miriam al Lashon Hara. Rashi has, in fact, used this exact expression, Lashon Hara, with regards to Miriam elsewhere. Over Yoiser Yuksha, the question gets even bigger in the next perek of the story in our parsha. La'alon because of Perish Rashi Sateva Diba. Later on, Rashi takes the same word Diba, which he's now quoting, when it appears later in the pasuk, and he says, Kol hoitzoas Diba l'shen chinuch dvarim. Any time that you talk about Diba, it means instruction to speak. V'yeshna l'toiva, v'yeshna l'ra'a. And it's not always bad. Sometimes Diba is positive, sometimes it's negative. Svim Kain, Madua Kosef Rashi Shelaksal Iske Diba, Bishar Shelosh and Diba Ena Machricha Shesh Nechet Bedava, Vadirabba Yitachin Shidutova. So why then, if Rashi wants to say the Meraglim should have learned from the Lashon Hara of Miriam and they didn't, why does he use the word Diba, which is ambiguous? It could potentially also mean positive language. That's question 1 on the Rashi's choice of language. Question 2. Why does Rashi have to tell us who the subject was of Miriam's Lashon Hara? That's irrelevant. Surely the message is, she spoke badly and was punished. They didn't pay attention to it, and so they also spoke badly and ended up being punished. It's irrelevant who Miriam spoke about. Surely over here the point is how Miriam spoke rather than who she spoke about. Question 3. Rashi generally is succinct, yet over here he seems to use language that is unnecessary language. Why does he refer over here to the Meraglim in this elaborate way? In spite of what they saw with Miriam, these wicked people didn't learn. He could have just said they. We know who they is. We're reading the parasha. We know it's the Meraglim. You don't have to now emphasize, Rashi, that they are the Reshoim called the Meraglim. Just say, and they didn't pay attention. Which brings us to question 4. Why does Rashi use that expression? They saw and they didn't take a lesson from what they had seen. Could have just said that they saw the lesson and didn't pay attention to it. Rashi's saying something else over here. They saw something happen and didn't take the lesson from what they saw. Why that language? Elsewhere, Rashi uses a different expression. It says, you saw the lesson and you didn't heed it. And lastly, how come Rashi in the headline includes the words lecha and anoshim, which he doesn't seem to be commenting on? Surely Rashi could have just used the word Shlach. Go back one parasha in Parshas Ba'aloischa, where Rashi also spoke about why the story of the menorah is juxtaposed right after the story of the Nesim inaugurating the Mizbeach. And there he just used the one word, Ba'aloischa, not the full phrase. So how come over here does Rashi have to say, Shelach lecha anashim? Okay, so what's really bothering us? Why does Rashi feel it's necessary to explain a chronological sequence in the Torah, which is so logical, and say, why did it have to be so logical? And then these 5 expressions, which all seem to be elaborate and unnecessary. So, in order to understand this, we have to ask a bigger question, which is, what did the Meraglim do that was so bad? Let's be honest about it. They were given a mandate, they followed their mandate, maybe they overstepped a little bit, maybe they said things they shouldn't have said, but is that really so bad? So, what was so severe about the Meraglim's sin? Their mandate was, go check out the land and report back to us. What is it like? What are the people like? What is the topography? What is the geography? What did they do wrong? They came back and they reported what they saw, truthfully. You want to know what kind of people? Strong people. You want to know what kind of cities? Fortified cities. What did they do wrong? So you know what you're going to say? You're going to say, well, the problem is that they then said, this is a land that nobody could survive. It's a land that swallows its people whole. Or maybe you'll say what they did wrong is they were asked to give a description. They also gave a conclusion. They said, it's impossible. There's no way that we could take the land. Maybe that's what they did wrong. The only thing with that argument, even though it is brought in many places, including Sichas, the problem with that is that Kalev responded before they said any of those things. Kalev already tried to silence them the minute they said, great strong people, big fortified cities, large fruit. He said, shh, vayas. That implies that already what they were saying, even though it appears to suit their mandate, was already inappropriate. What's so inappropriate? What did they do wrong? The truth is, even their conclusion that there's no way you could take Eretz Yisrael, we could defend that conclusion on multiple levels. Firstly, on a natural level, and even on a miraculous level. If you really read what the Meraglim said, they did not say, we won't enter that land. They said it is impossible for us to enter that land. Now that sounds like semantics, but it's a big difference. They made a simple calculation. We see how powerful they are. We know how powerful we are. According to the rules of nature, we cannot do this. What the Eibush is going to decide, that's his business. But it's not possible. In normal, human, natural terms, it's not possible for us to be able to succeed. Even when they said what the Gemara in Sota calls this heretical declaration that those people are more powerful than Hashem himself, the Gemara says it's like they were speaking about Hashem. It's not that they were being heretical, even though it sounds that way. What they were trying to say is that these people are so powerful that it's difficult to even imagine what kind of a miracle could uproot them. Not chas v'sholom to say that the Eibishter cannot do it, just to say we cannot imagine that level of miracle. That's why you'll notice Kalev, when he responds to them, doesn't say, oh, no, it is possible naturally. We can do it. We have this many soldiers and we have those kinds of weapons. Doesn't say that. And not only that, but Kalev doesn't even say that, don't worry, Hashem will do miracles for us. Instead, Kalev says something very radical. He says, we'll definitely go up. That even if Hashem tells us we have to make ladders and climb up into Shamayim, we'll do that. In other words, Kalev is acknowledging the fact that their argument has validity, certainly in the natural realm and even in the miraculous realm. That So Kalev is saying to them, we have to follow Hashem, even if that means we have to do something which has never had a precedent in history and hasn't even had a precedent in miracles. We're still going to do it. So what did these Meraglim say that was so objectionable? They placed the facts in front of the people and they made a conclusion which says, from what we can see, we don't see a way forward. We don't see a miracle that can win against these people. The mandate that the Meraglim was given was, go find out how the people operate, what the lay of the land is, so that we can strategize for a regular, normal human war. So they're well within their rights. And if that's what they were asked to do, give us the strategic analysis of this offensive, they did it. So what's so terrible that they deserve such horrific consequences? Because what? Because they said they had an opinion as well. So that's what Rashi has to answer. Rashi, by telling us that the Meraglim did not learn from Miriam, and that's why the Torah puts the two stories next to each other, through that, Rashi's illustrating to us exactly what was wrong with the Meraglim's attitude and their behavior. The fact that the two parashas are next to each other is there to illustrate for us what the Meraglim did wrong. Because you might have thought that the juxtaposition of the two parashas is wholly inappropriate because it could mislead us, and we might actually have a negative perspective on Miriam. So Rashi has to tell you that's not why the two parashas are there. We're not chas v'shalom looking to malign Miriam. We're trying to highlight what the Meraglim did wrong. The reason Rashi asked this question in the first place, even though the chronology makes tremendous sense, straight after Miriam was recovered, then the Meraglim went, why is Rashi even raising a question? Oh, Rashi knows that sometimes in the Torah it is correct and it is required to put a buffer between two portions in the Torah, even if they are chronological. And guess where we just saw that? In the previous parasha. In the previous parasha, Rashi comments in Shishi over the fact that it says, and when the Aaron was on the move, then this is what they would say. Asks Rashi, "Veloma nichtav kan kedei lahafsik bein poronios to foronios." Rashi says clearly that the reason that paragraph Vahi bin Aaron is inserted at that point in the Torah is as a buffer between two stories of misfortune in the community. Logic would say the same thing should apply here. If you read, as we do, the two stories, one after the other, the story of Miriam and then the story of the Meraglim, and I'll see that the common denominator is that they are both stories of inappropriate speech, speaking negatively about something or someone. Shemiriam v'Hameraglim are yeshavim b'dargosam chas v'sholem oishahoyu al kol ponim deimim usmuchim leze b'toichnon. You're going to see two stories that are so similar, you could easily jump to the conclusion Miriam and the Meraglim are of similar caliber, or Miriam and the Meraglim had stories where they did similar things. That's what you'd assume, because look, the Torah put them next to each other. Therefore, Rashi says, why? Why did the Torah take that risk? Why did the Torah potentially expose Miriam in an inappropriate way? Ironically, right? We're talking about Lashon Hora, and then you put Miriam in a place where people could think of her in a Lashon Hora way. Oh, she's like the Meraglim. Even though everybody could see blatantly that the results and consequences of Miriam's story and that of the Meraglim are vastly different. Because look, by Miriam, Gam lachar v'tisagir Miriam hareva amloi nasade Yosef Miriam ze'akavet cholek la'amokim. Miriam was put into a quarantine, sure, for 7 days, yes, but the entire community stopped and waited for her, which Rashi says is respect that Hashem showed her. Mashenken alef Meraglim v'yimusu b'magefa. The Meraglim were not quarantined, they died in the most horrific way. Not only were they punished, but the entire generation of people over the ages of 20 were going to die. And everybody else who was young enough not to be affected by this plague had to still circle in the desert for 40 years. So any thinking person can tell, okay, listen, the story of Miriam and the story of the Meraglim cannot be the same because the consequences are so vastly different. Still, there's a concern that Rashi has. And you could think it's not because the Meraglim was so bad, the Meraglim are similar to Miriam. The reason so many people were affected was because so many people took their story to heart and also became so to speak, rebels against Hashem. Therefore, they were punished. So I don't know clearly by the consequences that Miriam and the Meraglim are so vastly different. And then you'll say Miriam didn't have a long, big impact on the rest of the community because it was between her and Aaron. That's why Rashi, when he gave the headline for this commentary, included the words, not just Shlach, why is this parasha next to that parasha? But lecha anoshim, to emphasize Miriam. Because Rashi is trying to show us what's bothering him over here. You're going to look at these people. You know who these people are? You know who selected them? You know who empowered them? They are great people, at least when they started. So Rashi's using that to help us understand how much you might believe that Miriam and the Meraglim are of similar caliber. When Rashi uses those words, Shlach, Lecha, Anashim, he's immediately reminding us that these Meraglim were sent by Moshe on his responsibility. And the being befrat. So immediately you should be conscious of the fact that if these are the people who were selected by Moshe Rabbeinu for this job, they're the best we have. They're the people who have the greatest assets and the greatest talent to fulfill this particular mission. And that's why the Torah calls them Anashim, which is the word that Rashi includes in his headline. Anashim means people of stature. And Rashi says, when they started off, they were in a good space. So that's what Rashi wants us to know. You read this parasha according to Pshat, and it comes straight after Miriam, and your mind immediately tells you Miriam and the Meraglim have a tremendous amount in common. So Rashi says, therefore the Torah needed to highlight and emphasize for us that you would think the Meraglim are like Miriam. Oh boy, are they not like Miriam. Rashi says the best way to have made that distinction would have been to put a buffer in between, so that in your mind, two separate stories, two separate scenarios, two separate classes of people. Therefore, Rashi has this big question. If Miriam and the Meraglim are so different, why would the Torah allow me to misunderstand and believe the possibility that Miriam is similar to the Meraglim or vice versa? So Rashi is going to explain to us that yes, seeing the two stories one after the other might give you the impression that the characters, the personalities in the story are so similar. Says Rashi, I'll explain to you why the Torah did it. Not to make any kind of comparison between Miriam and the Meraglim, but rather to show you, look how badly the Meraglim messed up, because they had this vivid lesson right in front of their eyes and they ignored it. Rashi explains, Lefisha loksal iske dibo. Or Rashi tells us, why the parashas come together, because look what happened to Miriam. She spoke out of turn and suffered for it, and they saw it happen and they didn't take a lesson. The reason the Torah put these two parashas together is because we know that the Meraglim did something bad, because they rebelled against Hashem, or they incited rebellion against Hashem. But now we're going to see another layer of how bad the Meraglim's mess up was. In fact, once we know this particular layer, this particular perspective, we'll appreciate far better why the Meraglim were punished so badly. What made the story of the Meraglim so much worse? That they had an opportunity to pay attention to what was going on around them and to learn to avoid such a mistake, and they ignored the invitation. That's what Rashi says. What does Rashi want us to know? It's not something that they had to reflect on and go through a process of introspection and make comparisons. They saw it in front of their eyes. All they had to do was pay attention. That's all. But they didn't. And here's where the comparison lies. There's no comparison between the persona of Miriam and the Meraglim. Cannot compare. Miriam's in a class of her own. What you can compare is the nature of what kind of Aveira they did. There is similarity. How do I know? Because they should have learned from Miriam. They were about to do exactly what Miriam had done wrong. Because their behavior was going to be so similar, because their mistake was going to be so similar to Miriam's, that's why they should have learned from her. That's why Rashi doesn't just say Haim, they generically in the Meraglim didn't pay attention. He says they, the wicked people, didn't pay attention. Rashi is saying Rishoim to highlight that what links them to the story of Miriam is the nature of the sin, not the nature of the people. They're different people. They are Rishoyim. אבל בכל הנגיע לאנשים היו אלה לא יכולים סתם אלה רשעים הללו, ההפך בתחס ממירים שזה עתה בסמיכות המדע שכובד כל המוקים. By Rashi calling them Rishoim, he is separating them to the extreme from Miriam, who he just told us they wished to honor. So Rashi is clarifying for us that the closeness of the two stories is not to make any comparison between the personalities of the two stories, because they're totally different. These are Rishoim. What is the connection? They both behaved in a similar fashion. They engaged in an activity that was a similar activity. What's the similar activity? So, just as we asked the question, what was so bad about what the Meraglim did, we actually have to ask the question, what was so bad about what Miriam did? I mean, her intentions were not malicious. She was in the appropriate position to say what she said. She had genuine concerns. She went not all over the place. She spoke to her own brother. What's wrong with her attitude and her behavior? Like Rashi says, the fact that she said Moshe had married this Cushis woman and had now divorced her, that was fact. It's true that Moshe divorced his wife, which caused her pain. Plus, Rashi makes it absolutely clear that Miriam's intentions were not malicious. So what did Miriam do? The problem is that Miriam did not appreciate Moshe's greatness to the extent that she should have. She thought the greatness of Moshe was that the Eibusha speaks to Moshe. And then the Eibusha was going to explain that there's a whole lot more. It's not just that I speak to him pel peh, and he's b'chol beisi nemonhu, and he doesn't fall and collapse when he has prophecy, etc. So, because Miriam believed that the greatness of Moshe was that he speaks to Hashem like we speak to Hashem, and she underestimated his greatness, therefore, that's why she believed that Moshe should never have divorced his wife. So is it really appropriate that because Miriam underestimated Moshe Rabbeinu's greatness, which is be'ein aroich, is exponentially beyond what she could ever imagine? It's like a person standing on the ground trying to see the top of a mountain through the clouds. You've never been there, you don't know what it is, you can't see it. So for that, Miriam deserved such a hectic punishment? So Rashi explains, let's tell you what Miriam did wrong. The issue over here was not that Miriam spoke badly, but the fact that Miriam engaged in speak. Meaning, the fact that Miriam spoke a lot about Moshe, even if it was just to one person, to Aaron, the speaking a lot, the making a whole tumult about the story, that was the issue. The moment Miriam detected something that Moshe was doing that she couldn't understand, it was not appropriate for Miriam to then go and speak about it. Not just to speak about it, but to be engaged and enmeshed in the experience of speaking. Even though, as we've already mentioned, everything that Miriam shared was factual and none of it was malicious. Still, that engagement, that getting caught up in the conversation, the did you hear, what do you think kind of a conversation, that's not going to land up in Dibba Tova. It's not going to be complimentary or useful. If anything, it's going to land up in the opposite. And if Miriam really wanted to understand why Moshe had chosen to behave in a certain way, Miriam should have confronted Moshe privately and asked. So what's the issue with Miriam? What got Miriam into trouble? Speaking a lot about the topic. It's in this regard that the Meraglim are so similar to Miriam. Just like Miriam only presented facts, they only presented facts. But how they presented those facts, iskei diba, lots of talk, lots of conversation. What do you think? How are we going to do this? Moshe said this, that. Became a little obsessive. They spoke so much about it, they literally talked it up. The power of the people, the challenges of the land, to the point that the Jews started to panic. If the Meraglim were honestly bothered, how could they expect us to go conquer a land where there are such mighty warriors living there? Then well, then they should have kept their message short and then gone to Moshe and said, what's going on over here? You asked us to do this, but we don't think it's possible. But the fact that they spoke about it in so much detail and created so much conversation, they precipitated conversation around it, even to the extent of saying it's not possible. There's only one way that this could end: the people losing hope, the people rising up against Moshe, the people saying we want to go back to Mitzrayim. So now we're seeing the connection. The fact that the Torah puts the Meraglim straight after Miriam is not to suggest that the Meraglim were of the caliber of Miriam. There's no way. It was to show us how dangerous it is to speak in a way where you really ramp it up. You create a lot of conversation around an issue. Wow, there's so much anti-Semitism in the world. Did you hear this event that's happening? Did you hear that? What's going to happen? How could you still tell me we're living in the time of Mashiach? There's so many things. That kind of conversation, where you keep talking it up and repeating it, that was common to Miriam and to the Meraglim, and in both cases with devastating results. In the Meraglim's case, obviously exponentially more so. So, still, how could it be that Miriam did this? How could it be that Miriam engaged in this conversation about Moshe? This is Moshe Rabbeinu we're talking about over here. Who would dare to speak about him this way? So Miriam alludes to it in her own words, because Miriam says, we're in a similar boat. Is Moshe the only one that Hashem ever spoke to? No, he speaks to us too. The fact that Miriam was conscious of Deibisha speaks to us too, although Miriam agreed and appreciated that Moshe was of a higher caliber, but Miriam couldn't perceive how high, how much more. Miriam could not understand that it was possible that Moshe Rabbeinu could be on such an elevated status that would justify separating from a wife who everybody understood was the most incredible human being, and against the instruction of the Torah that a man has obligations to his wife, and in a way that caused her pain. In other words, what prompted Miriam to believe that she was justified to speak? The sense that Miriam had of her own spirituality. And the Meraglim had a similar issue. From their perspective, seeing as Moshe chose them and gave them the shlichus, in their minds, nobody could understand the shlichus better than they could. They were the hand-picked individuals by Moshe on Hashem's instruction. So nobody else is going to understand this conflict better than we are. Now, once they, through their personal experience, had perceived themselves as grasshoppers compared to the inhabitants of Canaan, they were absolutely clear that that was the shlichus. They fulfilled the shlichus. They came back with a sentiment, it's obviously true. Be'emes, for real. And so it should be for the whole Jewish community. And therefore they took on their own shoulders to arrive at a conclusion on behalf of the entire community. This is an impossible mission. Why did that happen? Because they overestimated their position. Why did Miriam criticize Moshe? Because she overestimated the status that she had compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. And because the Meraglim was so convinced that their perspective was correct, that's why they spoke about it so much. Because they needed to illustrate the point that we, the hand-picked shluchim with this particular mission, have come to this conclusion, so you need to understand it. Now we understand why Rashi didn't just tell us that the Meraglim learned nothing from the fact that look what happened to Miriam, but specifically from the fact that Miriam spoke about her own brother. That relationship is key to the story. That shows you just how much the Meraglim did not learn the lesson from Miriam, to appreciate somebody who's way greater than you are. As we see from the petition that Aaron HaKohen made on behalf of Miriam, so a brother is part of your flesh. It's your own flesh and blood. Besides the fact that Miriam said, I'm also a Neviah and he is a Navi, Miriam says, he's my family, he's my flesh and blood. It's really difficult to expect that somebody could get their head around the concept that this could be my sibling and exponentially beyond me in spirituality. It's like we grew up in the same house, we ate the same porridge. What are you talking about? How could you tell me Moshe Rabbeinu is on another planet spiritually? So we understand and appreciate how it is that Miriam misread the circumstances and misread the situation. And in spite of all these really good reasons why Miriam could be justified in her criticism of Moshe, Miriam was still punished. So the Meraglim should have learned from that. The Meraglim should have learned, look, if Miriam could not expect her own brother, who she brought up, who she protected, and Miriam could not expect him to have to conform to her reality, how could the Meraglim expect that the entire Jewish community, Moshe and Aaron included, should have to conform to their perspective? Another nuance that highlights the point very clearly in Rashi's language. Rashi specifies these wicked Meraglim saw what happened to Miriam. It wasn't a legend that was passed through the generations. It was first-hand information that happened the day before. On the face of it, Rashi could have skipped the word Ra'u and he could have just said, they didn't learn from Miriam. But why did he say Ra'u? To understand that there's another strange element of the story of the Meraglim. If we're really honest about it, what did the Meraglim discover in Eretz Yisrael that they hadn't ever known about before? Something that scared them to the extent that they said there's no way into the land. Whatever they saw in Israel, they already knew from before. And we'll prove it. We know for sure that while the Yidden were still slaves in Mitzrayim, there was a lot of correspondence between the two countries, and they knew what was going on in Canaan. They had to have been couriers, went back and forth. There were messages. They knew what was going on. They knew who lived there. They knew what... That's how it is. You know what's going on in the neighboring country to some extent, especially there where there was a lot of trade and food reliance and so on. When the Yidden were praising Hashem after Kriyas Yamsuf in Oz Yashar, one of the ways in which they praised Hashem is they said that the people of Canaan melted. That tells you, obviously, they knew about the inhabitants of Canaan and about their power. Because obviously, if they weren't powerful people, it wouldn't be a praise to Hashem that they melted. If they were weaklings and they melted, big deal. It's got nothing to do. It's not a praise of Hashem. And there are many other ways that we could prove that they knew this information about Canaan. And in spite of all of this, they were ready to go. So what changed when they saw the land? But as we very well know, you cannot compare the things that you've heard about to the things that you've witnessed with your own eyes. So as long as whatever they knew about Eretz Canaan was just hearsay, was reports, was secondhand smoke, okay, take it with a pinch of salt. Maybe people are exaggerating. We're still gung-ho. Let's go. Let's conquer the land. But when they saw it with their own eyes, anybody will tell you, no matter what you've heard about a particular event or about a particular scenario, until you see it with your own eyes, nobody can explain it. Once they saw it, then they backtracked completely. That's why look at the words that the Meraglim say. They keep saying, we saw. These are words that they used. They were saying, we saw this. You have to believe us. We saw this. That's why they brought the fruit to show them so that the people could see it with their own eyes. That's why Rashi has to say, yes, it's true that they saw all of the challenges, but they also saw what happened to Miriam. Rashi says they saw what happened with Miriam. They saw what happens when you speak around, even if you have a genuine concern. And you don't go address it directly to the person who could resolve it for you, but instead you create conversation in the community. You saw that yourself. That which you saw with Miriam should have given you the wherewithal to stand up to the challenge of what you saw in Canaan. If they had only heard the story of Miriam's second-hand smoke, you wouldn't be able to argue, why didn't you pay attention? Why didn't you learn from it? Because you'd say, look, the temptation to do what is wrong is because of things that we've seen, and the prevention from doing exactly what's wrong is because of something we've heard. It's an unfair balance. You can't expect that what we've heard will protect us from what we've seen. That's why Rashi says they saw what happened to Miriam. Why is it important to know that they saw what happened to Miriam? So that you know that the ammunition they had to protect themselves was as strong as the experience that they had. So there's a beautiful concept that we can learn in halacha. It's like what we call a chaduda, to kind of like sharpen your view of halacha. Comes out of this Rashi, but by first asking a question. Right at the beginning, Rashi was concerned that if we look at the smichos of the two parashas, you might think that Miriam and the Meraglim are similar in terms of personality and spirituality. How could the Torah have allowed the possibility of such a misguided interpretation? After all, isn't there an instruction in the Torah? You should always be clear and clean. Keep people clean. Let's not malign Miriam even incidentally. So it's an easy way out would be to say, as Rashi does say, that the Torah was composed each event as it happened. So Moshe transcribed what happened as it happened. So you could say, look, as the story unfolded, so Moshe wrote it down, because Moshe didn't want to delay preparing and presenting another part of the Torah. Now, at this point, the Meraglim haven't yet messed up. So maybe that's how it worked. Maybe that's why we have this chronology, because as the stories occurred, so Moshe Rabbeinu recorded them, and as he recorded them, he put them out into the public space, and so Shlach lands up being straight after Balo Yisrael. Now here's the thing. It's self-explanatory that every single day in the desert, including Chav Ches Sivan, where Miriam comes out of quarantine, Chav Tes Sivan, when the Meraglim get sent on their way, you can be sure that Many things happen every day. There are 600,000 adult males. That works out to about 3 million people in the camp. Especially as we know that they did move in between this time. They moved, which means they had to pack up the whole camp, they had to dismantle the Mishkan, then they had to get to the new location, set everything up again, Midbar Paran, put together the Mishkan again. Now, a lot of things must have happened between when Miriam came out of quarantine and the entire movement of the whole camp and Shlach. So if you calculate it, there were thousands of things that occurred between Miriam coming out of quarantine and the appointment of the Meraglim. Many of those things were actually on Hashem's instruction, whether it be the karbonos they brought in the Mishkan or when to move and when to stop. The point being, so there are many things Moshe didn't write them down. What did Moshe write down? End of Bal Oischa, beginning of Shlach. Miriam comes out, the story of the Meraglim. The fact that Moshe wrote them side by side means he has a document that the Meraglim could have looked at to remind them how to behave. Look what's happening over here. Moshe Rabbeinu is willing to ignore the possibility that the juxtaposition of these two parashiyos might shed a bad light on Miriam. Why does he want to overlook that possibility? Because it's important to have this information ready for the Meraglim to keep them out of trouble. Still a problem. We have a general principle which says you never tell somebody you do an Aveira so somebody else can get a benefit. Rashi addresses that. Rashi says the issue with the Meraglim over here is not that the Meraglim saw Miriam's behavior and they sinned, it's that they saw Miriam's behavior and they did not learn a lesson. See, this principle, the principle that you cannot sin in order to help somebody else, Rashi uses a very unusual, unexpected language to describe it. He says, you cannot do a sin in order that somebody else should not be punished. Strange, right? Rashi should have said, you cannot sin to prevent somebody else sinning. But he doesn't interpret it that way. He says, you cannot sin to prevent somebody else being punished with a serious punishment. Why? What's the comparison? So we should then recommend that Rashi is explaining what Tosfos also says. When we say that you may not sin to help another Jew, that's when the person's already done the Aveira. And so you are not allowed to sin now to mitigate the consequences of their Aveira, to protect them. But if there's an opportunity to prevent somebody from doing an Aveira, a serious Aveira in the first place, then we do say, you go ahead and do something which is a minor issue to prevent somebody else from doing a major issue. That's why Rashi says, you may not sin in order to help somebody avoid punishment. That Rashi is saying the only time I'm not allowed to sin for somebody else is if they've already messed up and I'm just trying to protect them from punishment. But if I can protect them from sin and their Aveira is serious and mine is not so serious, I have to be prepared to do that minor Aveira to stop them. Now we understand why the Torah was comfortable to put the two parashas together, even though that might create a minor Aveira. What's the minor Aveira? The possibility of implying that Miriam did something that classified her like the Meraglim. The reason it was valuable to do this is because this held the potential to stop the Meraglim from doing a very major sin. So we'll take that risk. We'll allow Miriam possibly to be exposed inappropriately so as to try and protect the Meraglim. That's why Rashi says they didn't learn a lesson. They saw what happened, and the Meraglim didn't learn a lesson. That's the whole point that Rashi wants to say. Why do you learn a lesson? To be able to safeguard yourself from doing the same thing. They saw what happened, they did not learn the lesson, so they did not safeguard themselves. Rashi is therefore alluding to the fact that why did this all happen? To try to safeguard them. I guess there is something we could think about for ourselves about the concept of taking minor risks in our Yiddishkeit, not chas v'shalom averos, but sometimes to put ourselves in a position where our Yiddishkeit is a little bit more difficult to uphold in order to stop somebody else from losing the Yiddishkeit altogether.